I'm the Group Human Rights Advisor at Rio Tinto, and I was also very fortunate to be part of Professor Ruggi's team when drafting the UN Guiding Principles, and we did a lot of work around corporate governance when we were drafting the UN Guiding Principles, so it's really great to see a session on this today. We have a full panel and a wonderful panel of people here who I'll introduce in a moment. We have until 10 o'clock this morning, so I hope that everybody will participate in the session. I'm just going to spend a couple of moments framing the discussion, then I'll introduce the panellists, as I said, and explain how the morning will run, and then we will hear from the panellists. So, corporate governance is a big phrase, and at its simplest terms really means the system by which a company or a business directs or controls its activities. And it ranges from all sorts of different processes. So there might be risk processes, compliance, the board roles and responsibilities, disclosure. There are a whole lot of different elements that make up a company's corporate governance practices, and there is no one single model of corporate governance. We see companies employing a lot of different types of tools. In my experience, good corporate governance and respect for human rights are mutually reinforcing. So where we see companies with good corporate governance processes, we tend to see that it's a little bit easier for them to incorporate respect for human rights into those processes and to use those existing processes to help them know and show that they respect human rights through human rights due diligence. Equally, where a company shows that it respects human rights and has a commitment to respect human rights, we can see that there are other aspects of corporate governance usually are quite strong as well, particularly in relation to anti-corruption or other activities as well. So they are, I think, mutually reinforcing. The UN Guiding Principles touch on corporate governance throughout all three pillars of the protect, respect and remedy aspect. So within the state duty to protect, we see in particular in Guiding Principle number 3, elements that say that, for example, laws that are there to set up and help companies to run should help to encourage companies to respect human rights rather than constrain them in doing so. And there is some guidance there around communication and reporting too. Throughout the corporate responsibility to respect, obviously we see elements of corporate governance appearing there, and also in remedy. When we think of non-judicial grievance mechanisms, of mechanisms that companies set up to handle complaints, these are also elements of corporate governance. So it's really good to be here today and to explore further what corporate governance means for the UN Guiding Principles. We have a couple of questions today that the organisers have asked us to particularly look at. The first is really to what extent existing corporate governance processes can be used to help companies to respect human rights, and what the limitations might be there. And one particular question that we've asked the panel to think about is how they can deal with the fact that corporate governance processes are often internally facing. They're often processes that are developed by the company internally, whereas we know from the UN Guiding Principles that to respect human rights, there does need to be external consultation. There needs to be stakeholder engagement in relation to challenges and opportunities. So how do we reconcile the internally facing nature of corporate governance processes and some of the aspects of the UN Guiding Principles? We've also been asked to look at how regulators are requiring or incentivising companies to use corporate governance processes to help them know and show that they're respecting human rights. And finally, what tools and innovations are coming out from investors, from civil society, from other groups to help support or encourage companies to respect human rights in relation to corporate governance. So in relation to our panel today, as I said, we're very lucky to have a very experienced group of individuals here, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to read out everybody's titles because otherwise I won't do them justice. So we have, on my far left, we have Mr. Armando Tripodi, who is the Social Responsibility Executive Manager of Petrobras from Brazil. We have Mr. Hiroshi Ishida, who is the Executive Director of the Roundtable from Japan, so welcome. We have Mr. Hans Petter Grava to my left, who is the Chair of the Norwegian National Contact Point under the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, so thank you very much for being here. And we have two commentators today as well. We have Lara Ceresna-Chaturvedi, who is the Policy Advisor at Cividep, on my far right, thank you, and Joane Goddard, who is the Group Head of Corporate Responsibility, Governance and Engagement at Aviva Public Limited Company from the UK. So thank you for being here. Just like what happened yesterday, we'll have 7 minutes each for each of the three panellists, and then we'll have 5 minutes each for the commentators. We'll then have some interactive discussion, and I really do encourage all stakeholders to participate in the discussion today. We'll give the speakers a chance to respond, and then I'll wrap up. Just a quick point about the rules of procedure today. So, as you were told yesterday, we have 3 microphones available today, and they're at the front of the room. We have 1 microphone for states, national human rights institutions, UN entities, intergovernmental and regional organisations, and that one is over there. We have 1 microphone for business enterprises, professional associations and networks, law firms and consultants. And we have 1 microphone for civil society organisations, trade union representatives, affected stakeholders, academics and others. So if we could stick to the process yesterday, and if everybody could line up at the microphones, that would be very much appreciated. And if you could limit your comments to 2 minutes each, and tell us clearly who you are and where you're from, that would be very helpful. If you don't have the chance to speak, or if you have a written statement which we would prefer that you don't read out today, you can always send it to the Secretariat, and they would be very interested, and I know the UN Working Group would be very interested to hear your comments on this area. So with that, I will turn to Mr. Tripodi from Petrobras, who will start off. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Good morning to all the panelists and the invited guests that are present here today. I apologize for having for speaking in Spanish. I'm from Brazil, so I'll be speaking in Portuñol. I would like to thank the Forum on Business and Human Rights for having invited me to participate to this panel. My presentation has as an objective to speak about the experience of Petrobras concerning the corporate governance system and the effective implementation of the second pillar of the guiding principles of the United Nations, the respect of human rights by companies. Petrobras is a company that is an energy company which is listed on the stock market. Its main shareholder is the government of Brazil. We are present in 25 countries at the moment, and we are leaders in the oil sector in our country. Petrobras has shown its commitment to human rights in its policies of social responsibility, and as well as its corporate values respecting human rights, respect to life, cultural diversity, ethics, and transparency, as well as its code of ethics. In terms of corporate governance, in April of 2012, a Executive Management of Social Responsibility was set up, and its mission is to develop mechanisms to integrate continuously social responsibility and decision-making processes in the operations of our company. This was a great advance which was made in social corporate responsibility and in human rights in general. Our main management challenges are focused on the following topics: social responsibility as a value for corporate culture, the respect of human rights in all of our activities throughout the supply chain, the management of risks and social impacts, as well as our relationships with the community and local development. To be able to take up all these challenges, we are working on the implementation of a system of corporate responsibility in which we are trying to include this theme in our existing management systems. This is a great a main project within our management system is the inclusion of social responsibility in our investment projects. Our management plan, business plan from 2013 to 2017, in this we foresee 770 new business projects, essential investments in our growth strategy, and the achievement of goals that we have set out for ourselves. Due to this, the decisions on projects must be based on precise information and complete information to allow us for the identification and and dealing with potential risks, not only economic risks, but also social and environmental risks. Given the aspects of social responsibility that exist, at the outset, in the planning phase, we took information based on very realistic information. Therefore, we need to be able to provide tools so that a project manager analyzes from the very beginning issues of social responsibility related to the regional configuration and the characteristics of society surrounding this project. Issues of social responsibility can increase costs, can have an impact on the hierarchy of the company and the quality of life of the people that are involved in the project. The topic of human rights is extremely important, and we are going to be looking at cultural heritage, communities' traditions, security services, protection of vulnerable groups, working practices, and resettlement. And topics that have to do with local development are education and culture, profit, opportunities for employment, technical development, and access to technology as well as to health services. The project includes analysis of social risk. To do this, we are going to be using baseline studies and participation processes with the communities, suppliers, and other interested parties. We will do this to identify and deal with issues related to human rights and local development, which will be impacted or influenced by new investment projects. This analysis will lead to a social responsibility plan for the project, which will include priority measures to mitigate the impacts and to try to provide new local opportunities. Our main baseline references, other than the guiding principles and ISO 26000, are manuals and tools of IPECA, the Global Oil and Gas Industry Association for Environmental and Social Issues, as well as ARPEL, the Regional Association of Companies in the Oil, Gas, and Biofuel sector in Latin America and the Caribbean. In addition to the efforts to integrate social responsibility in our business processes at Petrobras, we do believe that it is also fundamental to invest in activities that contribute to sustainable development. Our investments in social projects and environmental projects will take into account the following topics: inclusive and sustainable protection, biodiversity, sociodiversity, the rights of children and adolescents, forests and climate, education, water, sports. And as cross-cutting human rights issues, we could list gender equality, racial equality, and the inclusion of people living with disabilities. In the past 5 years, Petrobras has invested more than $800 million and has supplied more than 5 million people directly. has helped more than 5 million people directly through the development program at Petrobras. A new social program of Petrobras was launched at the beginning of November 2013. And this project will invest $650 million in social projects and environmental projects in the period of 2014-2018. To disseminate the guiding principles in Brazil, we carried out a large seminar on social responsibility at Petrobras with the participation of 500 members of our company, amongst which were high-level executives and professionals that work in our operations. The Professor John Ruggie was the main speaker, as well as George Kell, the executive director of the Global Compact. We also organized a training seminar on the guiding principles with Professor Ruggie and George Kell. This was held in coordination with the Brazilian network of the Global Compact for 200 companies that were signatories to this compact. In conclusion, I would like to reiterate that the guiding principles are our main reference for social responsibility within corporate governance of Petrobras, since it allows for the establishment of guidance on companies' responsibilities and also guidance on its commitment and relationship with governance and society. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tripodi, for those comments. And it's very interesting to hear about how considerations about human rights have been incorporated into investment decisions, and also about the training programs that you have done. So I'm sure that we can discuss that later. We'll turn now to Hiroshi. If you could go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to explain what the situation going on in Japan regarding on these human rights issues related to the business. That's a big issue, and it's a challenge as well. Translator, I will start reading from page 5. So it's very transparency, so they won't lost. Okay, I think I would just start thinking of how Japan, I think the one company they tried to establish to challenge this UN guiding principle. I found out it's really challenging and it's a really tough situation at this moment. And now, Roundtable Japan, we have 30-40 corporations, and we have been discussed for many years, and we came up to the conclusion we will become one team to collaborate, make this kind of the collaborative sort of the networking, not only the cooperation, but we have to make bridging how we challenge to discuss or dialogue with NGOs and NPOs. That is sort of the movement happened since last year. So we try to create this kind of not a member, it's a team, we called Nippon CSR Consortium. And this was established in September 2012 to raise awareness and promote activities in the field of business and human rights by offering a forum in which companies can discuss human rights issues with NGO and other companies. And the consortiums consists of corporate participants, NGOs, human rights experts, and representatives from academia. In 2012, the 68 participants consisted of 39 companies and 11 organizations, and this year, 35 participants were from 15 companies and 12 organizations. And there are some underlying factors that contributed to the establishment of the consortium. Companies sometimes struggle to address human rights issues with limited budgets and resources. Therefore, even once in a year, it is useful for the companies to get together to try to be leaders in their field by proactively seeking to understand and address human rights issues that their industry may be involved in. The consortium also emphasizes sustainability of activities. As stated above, the companies are committed to continuous efforts for incremental improvement in order to respond dynamically to a diverse range of issues, participant companies seek to stay abreast of changes and issues in their societies that potentially link their activities to human rights impacts. The Nippon CSR Consortium positions the Human Rights Due Diligence Workshop as an activity that aims to assist companies. There is 4 points. 1, identifying the assessing any actual or potentially adverse human rights impacts as defined in the UN Guiding Principles. 2, integrating the acting upon the findings. 3, tracking responses. And lastly, communicating how impacts are addressed with the affected stakeholders, such that companies can use the knowledge acquired to support their human rights due diligence activities. And the human rights issues by sector represents an outcome of discussion that began in September 2012 and is hereby open for public consultation. We would appreciate candidate comments on the draft from stakeholders. The final report will be issued February 2014, which is next year. So I've just explained the procedures of this, how we try to identify human risks, because I cannot judge myself. We need to discuss among the stakeholders. So the Nippon CSR Consortium guided the UN Guiding Principle has been working on identifying important potential human rights issues by industry sector. And in the 2012 Human Rights Due Diligence Workshop, important human rights issues by sectors were identified through dialogue among the participants based on the UNEP FY Human Rights Guidance Tool. And I would like to make 8 points of how we proceeding the workshop. The corporate participants, firstly, given lectures on business and human rights by members of NGO, NPOs, academics, and subject experts to enhance their understanding of the relationship between their industry sectors and potential human rights impact. So we assembled 15 NGOs. And company side, they're firstly really scared what was being announced by the NGOs. But I tried to be in the middle to make a good friendship together. And number 2, the second step is secretary of the workshop distributed a list of human rights issues likely relevant to the companies. And then number 3, the participant then discuss and select a human rights issue from the list that they believed to be important to their own company and discuss related, this is very important, to the value chain of their business operations. They also highlighted and discussed the basics for their decisions and designated certain issues as not relevant to their business. Result of the discussions was reported to the Secretariat. And the next step is responses from the participants were clarified by sector, supplemented based on the disclosure content described in the guidance tool, and redistributed to the participant by the Secretariat. In the next phase, based on the redistributed documents, the participants discussed the likely significant human rights issue that concern them, concrete concern, and value chain relevant to the concern each sectors. So now we have 10 sectors here with this index consortiums, and thereafter reported to the academic and expert stakeholders and the Secretariat. Then the next, the academics and human rights experts provide comprehensive assessment of these reports. And this final report was translated into English, Chinese, Spanish, and Japanese, and open for public consultation along with the original Japanese draft. And the public, yes. And then finally, the draft of these human rights issues by sectors reflects public comment was issued on April 3rd, 2013. So this was the year. So this is just a 1-year project. So when we complete it, and the company will start using this concept. And I've just used the follow-up, how we make this action, and I will just finish it up. So 4 points. So after this finalized draft of human rights issues by sectors. The promotion of human rights consists corporate activities by each company. One, activity to identify human rights issues of own company. Based on the human rights sectors, documents followed by the participant companies reviewed their own corporate activities, conducted dialogue on more detailed issues, and drafted company policies on the human rights issues. So there are several companies I can read out. Olympus Corporation, Nippon Express, Nippon Yusen Kaisha, Fujifilm Holding Corporation, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, and others. We have more than 5 companies. And next, involvement of relevant departments in a company. Some participants facilitated internal workshop involving the CSO department and other related departments aimed to raising awareness in relationship to the relationship between the business action and the human rights issue. And the next, fostering sensitivity of human rights issue. This is how you try to use this kind of the certain participant facilitated e-learning program for their workshop for improving understanding of the human rights issues. And the last one is approach to the top management, drafting human rights policy. Lectures were provided on high-level corporate management in relation to processes of converting human rights into subjects of risk management, and consequently, the companies drafted human rights policies to enable them to share, manage, and the same human rights issues globally. So this is how we try to proceed at this moment to link this UN guiding principle to their company's value chain and try to find out, identify as in the risk management. Thank you for your pay attention.
Thank you very much, Hiroshi, for a very practical example. It's very interesting to hear about the sector-specific approach as well, because I think there are particular processes within corporate governance that certain sectors might use more than others. So I think it's very interesting, and also the multi-stakeholder approach. And you can tell us more a bit later about how you built some of those relationships and friendships. So thank you. Now on to Mr. Grava. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this important debate on corporate governance. I think the main challenge is that corporate social responsibility is about going beyond legal duties, and it's about doing more than just avoiding harm. And for companies to achieve this, good corporate governance, of course, is of essence. And my perspective in this is how can governments contribute to the corporate governance processes in companies. And that's where the OECD guidelines for multinational corporations enter into the picture. Because these guidelines are recommendations addressed by the governments to multinational enterprises operating in or from the countries that are participating in the OECD. The guidelines are a comprehensive set of CSR standards covering a very broad field. Human rights is an important aspect, and the human rights chapter of the guidelines was revised in 2011 to mirror the UN guiding principles, so they are identical in content. The specific thing about the OECD guidelines is that, firstly, the governments have undertaken an obligation to promote and encourage businesses under their jurisdictions to follow these guidelines. So that's a binding obligation on the participating governments. And secondly, they have established an implementation mechanism, being the national contact points, from which I then represent the Norwegian contact point. The contact points, or the NCPs, they have two main tasks. One task is promoting the guidelines with information and encouragement towards civil society and business within each country. And the other is dealing with specific instances with complaints by individuals or NGOs or anyone who is affected by the operations of a company in issues that are relevant to the guidelines. This is a non-legal instrument. It's not legally binding on the companies, and the NCPs have no powers to demand compliance by the companies. So we work by trying to establish a dialogue between the companies and persons affected. And the main task is trying to facilitate an agreement between the parties on how the company should operate in the future. But in the event that it's not possible to establish such an agreement, we publish a final statement where we give our opinion on the issues of the complaint and on the performance of the company. And we also give recommendations to the companies on what they should do to adhere to the guidelines in the future. And this is then where corporate governance enters into the picture, because, of course, corporate governance is an important part of the recommendations that follow from the guidelines and that will follow from the dealings of the national contact point. The guidelines themselves stress the importance of corporate governance. In the general policies, they state that enterprises should support and uphold good corporate governance principles and develop and apply good corporate governance practices. And also that they should develop and apply effective self-regulatory practices and management systems that foster a relationship of confidence and mutual trust between enterprises and the societies in which they operate. I would like to give two examples from the cases that we have dealt with to illustrate this. One case was a Norwegian sea farming company that operated outside the coast of Chile in salmon farming. And a few years ago, there was lots of activity in aquaculture outside the coast of Chile. And it was managed in a way which proved to be unsustainable. So there was a breakdown in the industry with the great consequences not only to the environment, but of course to the societies, because workplaces were lost and there was an economic decline as a result of this. And the company, Cermaq, was then brought in to the national contact point. There was a willingness both from the complainants and from the company to try to reach an agreement on this. And a main part of the settlement that was reached was that Cermaq acknowledged that the Chilean aquaculture industry should have been operated in a more sustainable manner. And this was quite a big step, because initially the company was not willing to take any blame for this. They blamed the environment and the general industry and the Chilean regulations and so on. But of course it is a main condition for good corporate governance is to have an acknowledgement of what the issue is about. So this was, I think, a great achievement of this process, that the company was willing to go into this and base its future operations then on that understanding. Another case was brought to us against the big Norwegian pension fund. It was a case related to India, a steel plant in India, operated by a South Korean company, POSCO. Our relation to this was that the pension fund is a shareholder in POSCO, a minority shareholder. And we entered into this case then asking what is required of due diligence and corporate governance for a financial institution. Unfortunately, we were not able in this case to enter into a constructive dialogue with the pension fund. So we issued a final statement where we stated our views on what should be expected by a financial institution in such cases. And we gave then several points. The first point being that an investor should have a policy commitment enacted by the board and embedded throughout the institution, throughout the enterprise. And secondly, that they should develop relevant operational policies and procedures for risk management and due diligence related to human rights risks in the portfolio of the investor. And thirdly, that they should incorporate the dealing with human rights issues into the general management systems and general systems of investments and following up of the investment portfolio. And then that they should track the effectiveness of the response to human rights challenges and communicate to the public how these impacts are identified and addressed, and finally provide or contribute to access to remedy for those affected by human rights violations that are directly linked through a business relationship of the investor. Now, this may seem as a tall order for an investor, but of course the main emphasis in such cases is to develop a corporate governance system that can deal with these issues in a way that is relevant to the specific link between the investor and the human rights issues. I think I'll conclude there, and thank you for.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing those examples with us as well. And I think, again, it shows the parallels between good corporate governance and being able to respect human rights under the UN guiding principles, and that issue as well around having the right information, understanding what the risks might be and what the impacts are, and knowing what processes are available to get that information and then to learn from that moving forward is in the first example. So thank you very much. We now have our two commentators who are going to provide their reflections on what we've just heard, as well as their insights into the questions that we've been discussing. So we'll start with Laura, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair. My name is Laura, and I work for a civil society organization called Cividep. We are a labor rights and corporate accountability organization and work on labor rights and working conditions in the apparel industry and in the electronics industry in South India. We are based in Bangalore. I first want to comment on what I've heard so far, and I think we have had very impressive inputs from the different panelists, and it seems that there's a lot of good things out there, and a lot of companies have very good policies and practices in place. And I would just like to contrast that with my own experience from the field. We are dealing with global companies and also with their suppliers in India. And my experience from the ground is that many companies still do not fulfill even the minimum requirement under the UNGPs, which is to state their commitment to respect human rights in a human rights policy. Many companies still do not have a human rights policy in place. Even if they have, and we deal with companies that have had adverse impacts on communities or workers, it's very difficult for civil society organizations such as ours to actually get access to this information, to policies and processes. All of a sudden, companies tend to become very secretive and do not share relevant information or policies with civil society organizations or the rights holders, the people that are affected by their operations. So this is another problem that we have experienced on the ground. Human rights due diligence is good on paper, but it really needs to be implemented on the ground. It needs to address the affected rights holders, and it needs their approval, and it needs to include their perspective on the policies and practices that the company has developed. The UNGPs also recommend companies to involve rights holders when drafting policies and to engage with them continuously to see whether your human rights policies and practices actually match up to the needs and the requirements of communities and workers on the ground. In many cases, companies still only respond to an adverse human rights impact when they are caught, either through a civil society campaign or through media attention. This is when companies become active. So I think this is very clear that this is not effective prevention of human rights impacts. If you really want to prevent a human right impact, you have to be proactive. You cannot only act once a negative impact has occurred. So internal human rights due diligence policies and procedures have really little meaning until and unless they're implemented on the ground and independently verified. This includes direct engagement with rights holders whose rights are at risk. And I want to give you an example here. If we look at a company like Rio Tinto, which has a human rights policy and a resettlement policy that also includes free, prior, and consent, but we see that there are major problems in implementation on the ground. Colleagues of mine have visited resettlement colonies of Rio Tinto in Tete province in Mozambique, where around 1,000 people have been resettled to make space for a mining project. And what we have seen there is that people who have previously had fertile land and secured their livelihood through agricultural activities are now living in resettlement colonies which are absolutely unsuitable and are given land that is infertile and that leaves them without any scope to grow their crops that they need to secure their livelihood. So I think that this is a very good example of a company that has good policies in place, but it really is about how you implement these policies on the ground and how you assess the effectiveness of your policies on the ground. I also wanted to comment on some points that the other speakers have raised. I think what is very important is that we differentiate between voluntary CSR activities and fulfilling your responsibility to respect human rights. These, for me, are two different things. You might be engaged in CSR activities, but this does not mean that you prevent, mitigate, and remediate your adverse impacts. But this is what you actually need to do under the United Nations Guiding Principles. So I would encourage every company to continue with their CSR activities, but also to look at how you can prevent and mitigate adverse impacts that might occur from your operations. Then what we have heard from Hiroshi is that in your case, companies and NGOs are working together to implement these, to draft and then to implement these policies, which is great. But on the ground, we really have to see that there are a lot of power imbalances between companies on the one hand and workers and affected communities on the other. So I would encourage everyone to take these power imbalances into account and deal with them, because many impacts are so adverse that communities or workers are simply have lost the trust to actually engage with the companies in a remediation policy. And last but not least, I wanted to comment on the OECD guidelines, which we have also had experience with. And I think it's good that the OECD guidelines actually offer a complaint mechanism through the national contact points. But our experience has been that the outcomes of these mediations, of these conflict resolution mechanism, are very different and very much depend on the national contact point, on its track record, and are unfortunately not always as positive as in the case when we deal with the Norwegian NCP, which has a very good track record and which is very transparent. So I think there's huge scope for peer learning and peer review among national contact points. The example that was raised by Hans-Peter, the complaint against POSCO was filed at 3 different national contact points, and we got 3 different outcomes. So this really shows that there has to be more coherence and more, I think, cooperation among the national contact points to resolve complaints. And of course, from a civil society perspective, it's great that we have the NCPs, but there's no sanctioning mechanism. So it really depends on the willingness of the company to come to the table and negotiate with the community or with the workers. And there's no sanctioning mechanism beyond recommendations that are given in final statements. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think that you bring up, it's a very rich commentary that you provide. And I think that there is, again, coming back to that point about how to reconcile the fact that you might have internal corporate governance processes, but how do you get the information out there to other people so that other stakeholders actually understand what policies and practices you have in place? In a very quick response to the remarks about Rio Tinto, and I think it's certainly true, I'm sure, of a lot of companies, that it's the very first step to have policies in place, to set in place processes, and then obviously, as you've said, implementation is difficult. It's something that needs to be done at the site level for a mining company within the local context. But the very first step is to have the policies and processes there to start with, so that you have something and grounding to work with. Just a very quick point that a nice example of some collaboration and engagement has been Human Rights Watch's work in Mozambique, and really doing a very, very good job of engaging with companies and other stakeholders on the ground there to help companies like our own understand what challenges there are. So it's a good example of some multi-stakeholder engagement there. But thank you very much. To Jo, please. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, Vanessa. Thanks so much also for being invited to speak here today. I feel quite humbled in this audience. I want to respond to a little bit of what's been spoken about, but in order to do that, I want to give a little bit of context from where I come from. Aviva is an insurance, pensions and savings business. Our human rights impacts aren't probably as overt as some of the others that we've been hearing about. But still, we have them. I'm part of the team responsible for implementing our human rights policies and procedures at Aviva across the whole of the group, which of course includes our investment business as well, which is where we see possibly the majority of our indirect impacts.
Could the speaker please speak closer to the microphone?
Thanks. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. So in assessing our own approach to human rights through the Ruggie framework, we've thought about our governance of these issues and looked to our existing policies and procedures and mapped those to the Ruggie principles. We've done that with the help of the Danish Institute assessment tools. We still have further to go on that, I'm sure. Human rights is an integral part of our corporate responsibility programme. I note your point earlier. It's not just about corporate responsibility, but that's how we manage and govern it within our business. CR has oversight by our board through a separate committee, and so that we feel is the most senior oversight within our business. And we like to think that is a good way of governing our human rights risks and impacts. So as well as insurance and pensions, we are also an investor. And we are mainstreaming environmental, social and governance issues across all of our assets. And that includes, of course, looking at human rights. Human rights has always been a focus of our investment practice. It's something that we see as good management of human rights is an indication of good management of environmental, social and governance issues, and therefore an indication of good corporate governance within a business, which we think is a sign of resilience within an organisation. But it's hard to measure this. Certainly, I find it hard from the corporate perspective to measure what good human rights is. Certainly, from the investment perspective, it can be very hard to understand human rights practices. So in order to get better at this, we are working with a group of other bodies to look at developing a benchmark to measure, assess and report human rights for. Finally, it would be remiss of me not to mention child rights. It's not strictly on topic, so apologies for that, but it would be very hard for me to talk from Aviva and not mention child rights. It's an issue that we have been championing over the past couple of years. It stemmed from the work that we've done on a global community development project called Street to School, and it sort of stemmed from this sort of passionate belief that business has to be better at understanding our impacts on children, and so we have worked with the UN to develop some guidance around child rights. And on Friday this week, we'll be launching a call to action at the ASEAN Roundtable about child rights, how businesses need to understand their impacts better. And we've developed some case studies from about 6 global companies, and we are calling for dialogue on child rights. So to comment, that's Aviva, so to comment on what I've heard, I'm in awe, actually, of what I've heard, of what companies are doing. It makes me feel like we've got a long way to go here at Aviva, so I commend you on your practices, and fantastic to hear about what's going on in Japan. We note and have stayed close to what's happened in Norway, so I thank you for that. And I feel like I'm probably running out of my expertise here, so I'll conclude on that.
Okay. Thanks very much, Jo. And it's a very interesting question that you raise around, well, what is good human rights management? So how is an investor to know if the processes that companies have put in place and feeding off existing corporate governance processes are actually the right processes? What does good human rights management look like? And it would be interesting to hear from some people in the audience what indicators and what other measuring tools people are using to see if there is good human rights management. We're also seeing, and speaking to colleagues, a lot more questions coming from investors around human rights and more detailed questions around what corporate governance processes are in place. So it's an interesting development. I'm going to now turn it over to all of you. And we have, as I said before, the 3 microphones at the front of the room. So we have one for states, one for civil society and affected stakeholders, and one for business. I'll just give people a couple of minutes to come down, but we might start with, and if we could, as I said before, if you could just state your name.
My name is Marie Volby. I'm from the Danish Ministry of Business and Growth. And thank you very much for hosting this session. I think it's very interesting to be here and to hear the panelists and their views. I have first a comment and then a question. And first, my comment is I would like to share some experiences of the work we're doing in Denmark at the moment. Because this September, we just relaunched a practical tool for businesses called the CSR Compass. And it has been made in a public-private partnership between the Danish government and the Danish Confederation of Industry. And the purpose of the tool is to make companies capable of making a due diligence process, so to identify the risks and to make their policy and the strategies and to be able to follow up on it in a systematical way. It's not easy because we try to keep it simple. I guess that's always the difficult balance to keep. And it doesn't just cover human rights. It's the whole OECD guidelines agenda. So also environmental issues, etc., is covered, but with a focus on human rights. And right now, since Denmark has a lot of SMEs, a lot of SME companies, we've just started a program trying to help them to start using the CSR Compass and to train them and to use the experiences to other companies. And I'm glad to say that many companies have been very interested in taking part of this program. But the experiences from that I can share with you next year, maybe. Now, my question, I would like to ask you to maybe elaborate a bit of how you think that government could play a role in this agenda. What would be the most important next step to take? Is it sticks or carrots, or what do you think would be important? Thank you.
Thank you very much. The representative from civil society, please.
Thank you. I'm Stephen Oates. I'm Social Accountability International, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative which bases its work on international labour standards and international human rights instruments, and therefore, like the OECD guidelines and like the UNGP themselves, it has a secondary status compared with the primary status of those international instruments. I have three questions, actually, and one concerns the role which multi-stakeholder initiatives have in terms of not just social auditing, which is an activity which is criticized a lot, but also in terms of the capacity building to implement not just also, I would say, the secondary instruments that we have responsibility for, each of us, but also the primary instruments, which do need that interpretation for conditions of the private sector, of companies and other organizations. What sort of cooperation do you envisage with multi-stakeholder initiatives? And the second question related to that is how would it be possible to measure in a more objective way the performance of companies in relation to those standards? Of course, many companies, and we've heard some of them now, have reports and detailed reports on success stories. It's not always clear how objectively these can be measured against the international standards which we all aspire to, and there is a difference, and I hope we can all accept, between publicity and something which is more objective, and it would be interesting to know how we could get round the problem of confidentiality which you meet in social auditing, and reach some means of having a more independent and impartial assessment of the performance of companies. My third question is particularly about how you view the need to consult workers' representatives, and particularly representatives of free trade unions, because our impression is that this is often lacking, and this is a very good way of not only improving performance, but improving the objectivity of the way in which a company can present it. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. To the business representative, please. Thank you.
Thanks for having the opportunity to speak at this panel. It was a very interesting discussion. My name is Francesca Ciardiello, working with ENI, an Italian oil and gas company. I wanted to respond to the question on what kind of indicators we should use to measure the effectiveness of the policies and practices that the companies put in place. With this reference, I think this is one of the big takeaways of this meeting. We understand that despite all of the efforts that us as companies are taking into this sphere, it looks like this is not very much perceived from the external observers, and especially from the civil society. So I think this is definitely one of the areas where we should be working more in collaboration, because us as companies, in these years we have been, not only since 2011, but even before, and this is our case, we've been so much concentrated on looking at our practices and systems and identifying what were our aspects where we needed to work more, and in which way we could integrate human rights into our management system. So perhaps this sphere of reporting and of communicating and of sharing is something where we would also need inputs from the external observers, so from civil society and also research institutions. When it comes to the integration of human rights into management system, I think as businesses, we are very confident that there's a great lot that can be achieved with this. And I think this optimism is also based on the experience that we have had in other fields, like in safety or in environmental protection. And here I come back again to the area of reporting. I think now we're already reporting on aspects like we are using input indicators. So we're reporting on how many 8,000 audits we're conducting in a year, how many people we're training on security and human rights, and things like, these are clearly not indicators of effectiveness, but they're indicators of the efforts that we're putting into this. And I think with time, as we have seen in other subject matters, we will come to indicators which are perhaps more relevant and that will be also more able to let the others understand the extent to which the companies are putting attention to these aspects. Thanks for that.
Thank you very much for those comments. On to the government representative. Okay, thank you.
My name is Claire Hiroshi. I'm from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the UK. And I'd like to talk just a little bit about how the UK is focused on the issue of corporate governance. It's been really interesting listening to what the panel has had to say against the backdrop of the UK developing and launching its own action plan on business and human rights. And we're looking specifically at how we can help support companies in developing due diligence policies. It was also very interesting to hear my Danish colleague talking about the very practical work that they're doing. And I think there's a real role for governments here in sharing the expertise that they're developing and the sort of practical assistance which they're developing. In our action plan, we talk about the expectation that companies will adopt appropriate due diligence processes. And one of the main challenges for us is supporting companies in doing that and communicating to companies, as many companies as possible within the UK, how they can go about that. As part of that, we've developed a business and human rights toolkit, which is at the moment mostly for the use of other government departments and our posts around our worldwide network. And it's to really gear up officers at the operational end and going out and talking to business about the very specific things that they can do to implement due diligence policies. I won't go into the detail of that here, but if anyone's interested, we're very happy to talk about that in more detail. One of the commentators also mentioned the difficulty of accessing information on corporate governance policies. And as a government, one of the things that the UK is committed to do is signposting to companies in the UK and beyond as well, relevant guidance that already exists. And we've also committed to supporting the development of industry and sectoral guidance, including for SMEs, who I think have greater challenges in accessing a lot of this information and developing their own policies. And we look forward to working with UK business and NGOs in developing these. And just finally, just to mention the work that one of the commentators mentioned on benchmarking, we think this is hugely important. And again, this is something that we're looking to support as government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The representative from civil society, please. Thank you.
Yes. My name is Nina Gardner, and apart from being a sustainability advisor to companies, I'm putting my academic hat on as a professor of business and human rights at Johns Hopkins SAIS and at the American University Washington College of Law. I have a very specific question because I'm fascinated on how the national contact points are working and sort of bemoaning the fact that the U.S. one is sort of quite weak when we hear what's happening in Norway. Wondering whether there's a way to put a little bit of bite into the sort of the outcomes of national contact points, especially if there isn't a good outcome or sort of neutral outcome. Whether one could develop maybe a press release to Bloomberg or to the Dow Jones Sustainability Index people or something so that the investors actually would find out about it so that it may be relevant to them. It may not be, but you don't really hear unless you're really in the weeds what happens, the outcomes of the national contact points in the final statement, since it's not legally binding. It sort of goes there and is lost. And so it would be interesting to know, and it would be interesting to see whether this is something that Aviva would pick up if at some point there could be some kind of a mechanism that national contact points use to at least send the information to investors, and then they can decide what to do with it. That's just a suggestion, a question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. Do we have another business representative? Thank you.
I would like to speak in French if this is possible. My name is Said Sika. I represent Morocco, and I represent the National Council on Human Rights, which is a governmental organization, and I represent as well CGM, which is the General Confederation of Companies in Morocco, which represents the private sector. Since 2005, we have been very interested in corporate social responsibility, as there were many recommendations that came from the ILO and from the OCDE, as well as the United Nations. We created our own reference thanks to a private cabinet, and we created our own charter. A charter is based on human rights, and basically it is based on 4 criteria: the freedom of association, freedom of having trade unions, of fight against child labor, the improvements of opportunities, which goes in line with the fight against discrimination. In Morocco, we have 2 things that are very interesting. First of all, in the assessment tools, we have put in place a label, and this allows companies to be able to assess their work on corporate social responsibility. This label is given for a period of 3 years with intermediary periods for continuous evaluation. We really underline the improvement of continuous processes. Secondly, following the Declaration of Guiding Principles in 2011, we partnered with the local government to be able to implement the guiding principles in the first axis, which has to do with human rights. And it's thanks to this Council of Human Rights that we are present here today. What is also interesting in this approach is that we want to sell to companies the fact that CSR is not just a pure cosmetic product. It does not just value companies, add value to companies, but it will become a real fundamental strategy for the company. It's a way for them to mitigate risks. It's also a way for them to have better visibility and be more long-lasting. We are trying to involve more and more companies, and we are trying to make them adopt CSR and therefore to respect human rights even more. This has been very successful in Morocco as well as in other African countries. Many countries are inspired with our model, and I am available to anybody who would wish to have more information. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that example. Thank you. To the government representative, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Masa Nagoshi from the Mission of Japan to the United Nations in Geneva. And first of all, I'd like to thank all the panelists for presenting your experiences. And it's really an excellent opportunity for me to learn what is happening on the ground, including my own country, Japan. It's very interesting to hear. And it's very thought-provoking and inspiring to me. And thank you. And also thank you for commentators. My comment is rather of a personal interest. I would like to hear a bit more about national, maybe barriers or nationally specific barriers that you're facing when it comes to discussing the issues related to human rights. The thing is that, for example, in our country, I think Japan, if I'm not mistaken, I think when we talk about human rights, I think my feeling is that it is mainly about discrimination on, for example, on gender or women, or discrimination based on maybe other backgrounds, but not all people really think about the entire set of all human rights. So I think there is a kind of a cultural barrier when we start discussing about issues related to human rights. And I imagine that a lot of Japanese companies are facing this kind of cultural obstacles or barriers when they try to integrate first the guiding principles on business and human rights, but first and foremost, the concept what human rights stands for. And I think it's maybe, maybe in other countries there should be certain kinds of cultural barriers in order to really integrate the GPs into their own national context and into their own national corporate governance culture. So I'd like to hear a bit more about, if there's any, whether there are some you consider to be a cultural barriers or nationally specific barriers in order to really integrate the concept of human rights and the guiding principles in our national context. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. To civil society, and this will be the last comment before we turn back to the panel, so thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ron Subasinghe, and I'm the legal advisor at the International Transport Workers Federation, which is the global union federation for national transport sector trade unions. I just wanted to ask whether the panelists and commentators see a distinction between corporate governance and corporate social responsibility. More often than not, and even today, I think the terms have been used interchangeably. The way we see it, I suppose, is that corporate governance consists of with management interests, which are, I suppose, strongly aligned to shareholder interests, whereas CSR involves self-regulatory rules and norms dealing with business ethics, and they don't always reconcile. So just be interested in the panelists and commentators' thoughts on this. And then a quick question each for the three panelists, if that's okay. Mr. Tripodi, you mentioned that your CSR policy applies to the entire supply chain. So I was wondering whether the labor and human rights of transport workers, be it maritime workers or truck drivers, figure in this mapping exercise, transport being a fundamental cog in the energy sector supply chain. Similarly, Mr. Ishida, I wonder whether transport featured in your organization's sector-specific analysis. And then finally, a question for Mr. Grever. I understand that the Norwegian NCP approached the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the application of the guidelines on the financial sector. I'm just wondering if you could just enlighten us on what you've heard back, because I suppose just like the Costco case, this could have massive implications, not only for the financial sector, but for those at the receiving end of adverse impacts. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions for the panelists, and also for your first question, which I think is a very interesting question about the parallels between the two. If we could now, we'll just go in order again of each panelist, and if you could just limit your remarks probably to around 2 minutes so that we have enough time. Thank you.
First of all, regarding trade unions and workers in Petrobras, we have a corporate policy to include workers in all our strategic decisions. The workers can go to our administrative council.
Estratégicas de la compañía. Anualmente, compañía.
We also have a union agreement with workers as part of the operations with transport operators as well as the maritime operators who work internationally and nationally. We also use an annual report that we publish. It is a very good initiative, and we have set up ourselves as a world reference. This report deals with the human rights aspect, and right now we are working with some international entities to integrate social and environmental reporters in the accounting of the company in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ishida, if you want to. Thanks.
Okay, I think you mentioned the question for this industry basis. We have a logistics. So you can go to the Caux Roundtable Japan website, and I think everybody can read, this time only English and Japanese. And you can identify how the Japanese corporation had classified all those issues. And any comment is welcome by the end of this 17th of December. And I think many issues I have heard I think in this process of the corporate governance, how you practically implement to this business about human rights issues, I think there is 4 standards: input, process, outcome, and feedback from NGO. Input, process, outcome, and feedback. I think those are the process. Because before I joined this organization, I was a risk management in the finance sectors for 5 years. So I'm in the professional how you deal with this kind of the risk. And I think this is how you try to transform, not using this human right. I think my colleague Japanese mentioned that if you talk about human rights in Japan, nobody said, what is it? The discrimination, power harassment, something like that. But here we are talking about more holistics of this approach. And the reason why the human rights words actually came in Europe in 1485 in Italy, Pico Milandra. That was the long history that you have been discussed human rights issues for a long, long time. But here in Asia, in Japan, Far East, it's really still an early stage. But we are trying to implement how we can catch up. It started, I think it's after the World War II or in less than 100. So we are in a process for the Japanese industry how to overcome this catch up or this human rights issue. But we have a similar concept of like Kyosei, living and working together for the common goods. This is more like Buddhism and Confucianism. So we are now still in sort of the difficult, strange, and challenge stage, how we try to convert this kind of the Asian sort of the philosophy and value and culture, how we try to apply to these human rights. It's more like Western sort of the perspective. And I think we need this kind of the opportunity of a space, and I think this is a great opportunity to deal with and have a conversation. And I think we need a lot of helps and support, and I think this is more likely we can overcome these human rights issues, because Japan has more like global companies as well. Okay.
Yes, thank you. There were very many interesting questions, and I would like to deal with 3 issues. First, there were some questions raised to the NCP process more specifically, but I would also like to comment upon the issue of development of measurement tools and benchmarking, and also on the need to consult workers' representatives in the process. When it comes to the NCP, it's true, of course, that there are 46 adhering countries and 46 different NCPs, and a main challenge is to develop functional equivalence among the NCPs, and that's the work that's going on within the OECD with peer reviews, and which is also dependent upon input from business, NGOs, and stakeholders. So we need everyone to contribute to develop a more coherent NCP system. When it comes to the POSCO case, more specifically, with the 3 different outcomes, I would say, of course, there were 3 different outcomes because there were 3 complaints against 3 different companies. So even if we had been more coordinated, there would have been the possibility of 3 different outcomes, because each company is individual in its approach and connection and relation to the guidelines. So that's not very surprising. Thank you for also the comment on how to put more bite into the outcome from the professor from Johns Hopkins. That is, of course, a challenge to disseminate the results of the NCPs. We do have press conferences and press releases, and I think our case against the Norwegian pension fund reached Reuters and The Economist, but basically, of course, it reaches the national press, and unfortunately not that many people read the Norwegian newspapers daily. It's a very little part of the world population. When it comes to the High Commissioner and in the POSCO case, the High Commissioner issued a statement which was very clear on the application of the UN guiding principles to financial institutions and asset managers. And I would also like to refer you to the Economic and Social Council, which last week, in its comments to the report on Norway, specifically also took up this point and stated the need for that the Norwegian government should ensure that the investments by the Norwegian pension fund are subject to comprehensive human rights impact assessments. So that was also a very clear statement from this Commission. When it comes to measurement tools, I think this is related to one of the basic issues that we have, the relationship between legally binding questions and questions of non-legally binding. I don't like the sort of the vocabulary of voluntary or non-voluntary, because of course it's not voluntary for companies to perform in a way that's good to society. I think it's absurd to talk about voluntarism here. But another matter is that it's not legally binding, and that's the main issue with the UN guiding principles, that the remedy part is the weakest part, and that's because one has not yet seen legally binding requirements on corporations and private entities on an international level. And to the extent that it is an issue of binding legal rights and infringements of rights, of course companies will contest allegations of the break of rights. That's not something that's limited to human rights. It's in any case where there's an allegation about a breach of right, a company will contest it if it is contestable, if there is no business relationship or anything that makes it more opportune to settle it. So to use infringement of rights as a benchmark, I think, is impossible. It only will lead into issues of litigation and conflicts of law. So what we have to do then, I think, is to try and develop benchmarks on of a non-legal nature. And I think there the level of acceptance, the level of social acceptance in the communities where the companies are operating is, I think, one of the only benchmarks that can be used, in addition, of course, to the level of acceptance by the governments in the host countries where they're operating, local governments, central governments, and so on. This is not a matter of developing precise tools for measuring, like pollution levels or the development of rights. The third issue, the need to consult workers. Coming from Norway, our tradition is that management systems must be established in cooperation with the workers' organizations in the company. And I think that also is a way of producing good management systems. And I think that that's an example that should be used, that the management tools are more relevant and will be implemented better into the company if they are developed in cooperation with the workers' representatives.
Okay, thank you very much. We're almost out of time, but if the two of you could just provide some quick reflections, that would be wonderful. Thank you. To Lara first and then Jo. Thanks.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with Hans-Peter Grave that the need to consult with worker representatives, with unions, is essential, and freedom of association, as we have heard yesterday in the session on supply chain management, is not only a core labor right, but it can also help companies to assess problems at a very early stage and deal with these problems at the factory level. So that's absolutely essential. I was happy to hear about the guidance that is prepared by the Danish government and also by the UK government, and about the question of the Danish Ministry of Business, carrot or stick. Well, coming from civil society background, I definitely say stick. More regulation, make it mandatory to report on social, human rights and environmental impacts for companies. And just because I was asked to present this as well, we have published a guide for civil society on the UN guiding principles, which is in really easy language to understand the principles and to use them in company research and advocacy. And the guide provides two parts: one, to assess a company that you deal with that you don't know yet and see whether it has policies and practices in place that are required under the UNGP. And the second guide is when you deal with a company that has already caused or contributed or is directly linked to a negative human rights impact, and explains then how the UN guiding principles, what the UN guiding principles expect this company to do. And there's a checklist for you to see and check whether the company is actually doing it. I think in terms of outcomes of NCPs, maybe what could also give it a little more teeth is if we have very concrete follow-up plans, that the final statement is not like the final communication, but there's actually a follow-up in due course of time over the outcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Jo?
Yes, just very briefly, I think there's probably quite a lot I could say around benchmarking and measurement. I feel like I've heard support, or certainly a need for that from the floor, so that's fantastic. That is a good demonstration of our multi-stakeholder initiative at the moment. I don't know whether I can use that term in this forum, but that is the development of that benchmark is sort of supported by us and the Institute of Human Rights and Business, but involving many people, the FCO included. So thank you for your support on that, as well as BIS too. We also welcome the UK action plan, and to Laura's point about carrot or stick, we've actually noticed a lot more business organisations talking about human rights, us included, because of the UK requirement now to report on social, community and human rights issues. So that has been a massive development, I think, for large UK companies. We also, I just wanted to mention also, comment very, very briefly on the guy from the mission of Japan. We also don't talk about, I don't think, consistently the whole remit of human rights. One thing sort of leads to another. I don't really find that that's necessarily an issue. It's something I'm aware of, but we don't always talk about all human rights at the same time. So I wouldn't necessarily worry about that so much. And then finally, the distinction between corporate governance and corporate responsibility. I do see that as very different. You're right, there are times where there could be a slight conflict, but I like to talk about responsible corporate governance, and certainly that's something that we want to support and hopefully are doing. So I think that's probably it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're out of time, so I won't try and summarise the very rich discussion that we've had. Just, I guess, very 3 quick points. I think we've heard that information is very important, so that when companies are implementing, using existing corporate governance processes, that the information gets out there, that there's dialogue with external stakeholders around that, and also that implementation obviously is a key challenge. So I'll stop it there. If you could all join me in thanking our panellists and our commentators, that would be great. Thank you. Thank you, Anna. We'll close the session. Thank you.